Hey there! Since we've all been immersed in vino Italiano this season, I thought it would be fun to revisit this episode while I'm, let's just say, out of the cellar this month, getting our Grappa On, Season 10, Episode 3. First released in June 2022, it was a deep dive into Grappa, the bold Italian spirit made from pomace, with anecdotes on its enduring appeal across centuries. Why August? Well, as summer transitions to harvest season, Grappa's rustic artisanal character resonates with end-of-season flavors. I'll see you again in September and we'll pick up where we left off, moving our way down Italy's boot. Till then, enjoy this refresh. Welcome to Glass in Session. I'm your host, Val. Thank you for joining me. We are getting our Grappa on today, which I assume you know because you clicked play, which means you, my friends, either want to learn more about Grappa or you can't wait to see how I'm going to tie the subject into something like, I don't know, barbarians, dinosaurs, monks, rappers, cartoon characters, little green poodles, swashbucklers, cowboys, criminals, or even something ridiculous like dog flatulence. It's happened. Never underestimate me. But for now, let's focus on the Grappa. Where does it come from? How was it made? Let's look at some history, styles, and proper service. Grappa is part of the brandy family. It's made with grape pomace. You might be asking, hey Val, what's pomace? This is the leftover skins, the stems, the seeds, all that chunky stuff you see at the winemakers throw out, the part of the grape that's not made into wine. That's the pomace. In Italian, it's vinaccia. Specifically, Grappa is classified legally in the European Union as grape mark spirit or grape mark. Let's look a little bit more at the law. Grape mark, by definition, must be made from, you know it, grapes. It's eventually distilled in either batch or continuous methods, doesn't matter which, read pot stills or column stills. A little aside, I've learned that more artisanal producers will use a pot still and do it in batches, or the column stills might be used for the more industrious or the higher production kind. But again, that's up to the distiller. There are specific, however, distillation requirements, and it can no longer be distilled at wineries by traveling distillers as in the days of yore. Yes, at one time, the winemakers could just sit around and wait for these distillers to come around and take their leftover pomace and chunks and make it into their spirit. But now, by law, winemakers have to bring their pomace into the distilleries. You see, back in the day, the compounds produced from the stems in that pomace, they would produce this toxic methanol. That's bad. So laws were tightened up. This is good because the quality of the Grappa is way better than the hooch of yore. The pomace sent to the distiller can either be fermented or unfermented. And you might be asking, well, why does it matter? Well, a lot of times, depending on the color of the wine being made, this will determine the pomace state, if you will, or the type of pomace that is sent. A lot of times, if it comes already fermented, it's going to come from the red wines, which means there's already been the conversion of grape sugars to alcohol, because a lot of times the grapes will spend more time on the skins in the case of red wine, or in the case of white grapes or white wine, the pomace may not have undergone fermentation, in which case it's referred to as virgin. A lot of times the juice is pressed off the white grapes to make the white wine. So this is a totally different kind. The Oxford Companion Spirits and Cocktails also treats us to the half-fermented variety from rosé wine. So yes, Italy does some fine rosé or rosato wines. I dedicated part of season 1 to these. I can link it up if you'd like. But in the latter two cases, in the case of the virgin, the white grapes, or the rosé wines, the partially fermented pomace or vinaccia, the distiller will have to ferment it before doing that thing, and according to law, thou shalt not add water, distill it chunky, please. Again, by law. And that thing is, of course, distillation. Distillation, you may remember, is simply heating up that vinaccia enough to separate out the more volatile elements. The volatile elements meaning alcohol. Alcohol is a lower boiling point than water, and it will form these vapors. As these vapors cool and they condense, they yield, guess what? A higher alcohol liquid. In the case of Grappa, all distillations must be less than 86% ABV. Lees, these are the expired yeast and fermentation leftovers. These can be added to the grape mark, but they must not exceed 25 kilograms for every 100 kilograms of grape mark. The aromas will come from other compounds. We've talked about the congeners before, aldehydes, esters, all those things that give us spirit, including wines, their aromas. They are a byproduct of that initial fermentation. So it's up to the distiller to determine how the distillation will be done. Again, what kind of still to use, what kind of batch or continuous pot or column still. There are other little adjustments the distiller can make along the way to make sure only the finest compounds and aromas characterize his or her final spirit. The finished product, the alcohol by volume will be at least 35%. If the grappa bears a geographic indication, such as Grappa di Barolo, it will be at least 40%. Often they're a little bit higher. There are other things that can be done with the grappa to influence style. For example, if the grappa has spent less than 6 months in glass or acciaio, which is stainless steel, it's referred to legally as giovane or bianco, young or white. This is most of what you're going to find. Pretty clean spirit for the most part. If for 6 to 12 months the grappa is finished or affinata in legno or finished in wood, you may see that term affinata in legno on the bottle. More than 12 months in wood, consider it aged, vecchia or invecchiata. Stravecchio is a very old, also called Reserva, and if you see that on the bottle, it means your grappa has hung out in wood for at least a year and a half. Oak is not a requirement as other types of barrels are used. I've seen chestnut barrels in northern Italy for some really great wines, so why not for grappa? There's also acacia, cherry, ash, other kinds of wood that's being used. Something I was treated to several times in Italy was single varietal grappa, meaning it was made from one grape, aka monovitigno. In this case, 85% of the grappa must come from that one grape. One of the more common grapes that you're going to see making grappa are going to be things like Moscato, Cabernet, but I've seen them made with Corvina and things like that. There's also something called vintage grappa, very rare. And I didn't see anything about this in the law. It might be in there, but I might have missed it. But it's out there. And Jacopo Poli on his Poli Museo della Grappa website, it's very well done and informative. And I refer to it a lot for this podcast, but this is not an ad. It's just a really nicely done website. But he does talk about this, and he gives a really good look into the myriad of flavored grappa out there as well. According to my trusty CSS study guide, a first stop for all my spirits references, it was Nonino. That was the first out of the gate in 1973 that produced the single varietal or that monovitigno type of grappa. They were using the white grape, the Piccoli from Friuli, a grape you may have heard me lovingly pontificate on in the dried grape episode. Yep, link that up too. And while I mentioned that grappa is only grappa if it comes from Italy and made in accordance with the laws, we should be aware that many vaunted wine regions have protected geographical indications. And I counted 9 in addition to the overall Italy PGI and Annex 3 geographical indications for spirit drinks of the EU law. Now, these include wine regions you already know, such as Sicily, Alto Adige, Veneto, Friuli, Trentino, Lombardia, and Piemonte. But there are also more specific appellations like Barolo and Marsala. So why then, in the days of yore, were winemakers taking the chunky wine leftovers and making booze from it? The short answer is because they could. A more precise answer dates back to feudal times. Think medieval era when serfs or peasants had to turn anything over produced from the land that they worked. They had to turn it over to their landowner or lord. This pyramid scheme, as I like to call it, was a social hierarchy in which there were agreements, loyalty, a bunch of kneeling and all that. But at the bottom of this scheme were these serfs. They were given land in exchange for work. Very simple. That way everybody could have a little something. I linked up a proper lesson on feudalism if you are interested from World History Encyclopedia, as opposed to the abridged version I've just flung about. When it came to the winemaking, all that goodness that the landowner produced, all the grapes, the wine, everything that was made, it went to the landowner or landlord. Let's go with that since that's where the word comes from. But the peasants were permitted to retain the pomace. Gee, thanks for all the chunky leftovers, landlord. What do resourceful peasants do with leftover wine grapes and chunks? They make booze. Of course they do, which pulls us further down the rabbit hole of history. While no one knows exactly where and when grappa first showed up in a glass as grappa, most likely there were monks involved. Of course there were. Difford's guide and Istituto Nazionale Grappa, the National Grappa Institute, tells us that it very well may have been the monks of the Italian Benedictine variety from Salerno who grabbed onto distilling knowledge to create medicinal alcohol by preserving plants with certain properties. Because of course we know that alcoholic beverages have their roots in medicine. That makes sense to all of us. The Poli Museo that I mentioned earlier and the National Grappa Institute both point to the Scuola Medica Salernitana around the year 1000. These monks were practicing distillation in the service of health to the population. A 2004 academic paper on the National Institutes of Health website here in the U.S. by De Vitis, Capabianca, and De Vitis states that the Scuola Medica Salernitana is, and I quote, considered the oldest medical school of modern civilization, end quote. Before that, however, we may remember that the science of distillation does have its iconic origins in 8th century Middle East. That's right. It was the Arabs that created alcohol, and we've talked about that before. The Moors brought this knowledge to Sicily around the 9th century, and then, of course, it eventually spread throughout Europe. Diffords goes on to cite writings from the 1300s that target aforementioned northern Italian regions like Alto Adige as the historic places of origins for grappa, but it really wasn't called grappa yet. Grappa could come from Italian words having to do with grape stalks, grape bunches, other grapey things like graspo, grappolo, or the Latin word, says Diffords in the Italian Tribune article I linked up. It looks like grappopolis. It means bunch of grapes. You see where this is going. The CSS study guide, the Oxford Companion to Spirits and Cocktails, point us toward the town of Bassano del Grappa in the Veneto as the home of grappa with respect to origins. Poli tells us that Bassano del Grappa was actually called Bassano Veneto until 1928, but is located at the foot of Mount Grappa. And the Italian Tribune brings to light a legend pinning Grappa's origins also to Bassano del Grappa, but during the 2nd century, and that it was a Roman soldier. So as far as Grappa's origins in colloquial Italian, translation, who knows? But we have a few clues to keep things interesting. Not ironically, Difford's guys tells us that Bortolo Nardini started making his grappa in 1779. Where else? Bassano del Grappa. Nardini is the oldest grappa producer in Italy, even though back then it was called precisely acquavite di vinaccia. And remember the word for pomace earlier? In English, water of life from vinaccia. Makes sense. Also, according to Poli, we can thank Michele Savonarola, a medic from Padua, for writing De Arte Configenti Aquam Vitae, or The Art of Distilling, looks like, The Art of Distilling Water of Life, in 1532. It outlined how to make a spirit from pomace, and I believe there's still a copy of that book up there in the museum. In 1951, we'd see the word grappa given its official denomination. It was no longer called aquavite. Oxford Companion notes that in Piemonte, they used to call grappa cote, or cote, C-O-T. I had never heard that before, just in reference to Malbec grapes in Western France, but we can go with that, sure. And the word grappa, of course, wouldn't be legally defined until 1989. Other grappa goodies? Today, there are at least 130 grappa producers, or grapperie, in Italy, mostly in the north, but they're all over Italy. Cool. But apparently other countries like US can make their version of the Mark spirit and call it grappa too. Not so cool. How does one enjoy grappa? That's really the important thing. However you're getting it or however you're drinking it, the popular way I've enjoyed it, which has been as an after-dinner, kind of like a digestivo with an espresso, you can kind of add it to the coffee, which is called a caffè corretto. That would be corrected coffee, literally. Or you could kind of sip it on the side, and then after you finish the espresso, you rinse out the espresso cup with the leftover grappa and sip that back. Have I had it for breakfast? Yes, I have. And that is a thing. It can be a breakfast drink. Grappa's not just for breakfast anymore, though. Proper service, as depicted on the grappa.com website or on the Poli Museo del Grappa, shows some suggestions in addition to the lovely straight presentation in a tulip-shaped stem. I have some examples from Mazzei I can post on the socials. And finally, something that was taught to me during my time living La Vita Bella, where I fully exploited that whole dolce far niente thing, the sweetness of doing nothing to the max. That is to test a grappa's quality. Rub a little bit on your wrist. It should smell pleasant, maybe like hay or flowers or meadow. Otherwise, if it doesn't smell like anything good, it may not be the best quality. This was also backed up by that lovely Italian Tribune article that I've linked up. It's loaded with cocktail and food recipes that use grappa, including this Venetian fog cutter. It uses grappa, light rum, cognac, lemon juice, and orange juice. Shake together, strain into a brandy glass, serve over ice. I had to link that up too, because there's actually some food recipes on here too, like peaches and grappa, and looks like a whole bunch of other really great stories on food in this resource. I just found it and it's fantastic. So to summarize, grappa. It's made in France, where it's called Mark, but if it's made in Italy, it's called Grappa. And if it's made anywhere else, we can call it whatever the hell we want to, but it's not going to have that sweet, sweet Italian peasant fiefdom Roman soldier monk history behind it. As always, grazie mille for making room in your podcast distillation app. See what I did there? Every couple weeks for drops of silliness from me. Oh my God, I did it again. Somebody stop me. I do love hearing how much fun you're having with some of these episodes, so please keep the comments coming. I love hearing them. Holler at me on Twitter at WineGallonBoxed. Email me at val@glassandsession.com. On the Facebook, Pinterest, and Insta Spaces, where I will post those grappa pictures for you, I'm Vino with Val. Glass and Session is a production and registered trademark of Vino with Val, LLC. Music is Write Your Story by Joystock. Website is glassandsession.com/podcast.